This video is going to be hard to follow if you didn't watch the Lexus Ate My Homework video. In that video, we worked out that Trooper Paul either deliberately removed the date and time column from this chart with the key cycles, or he didn't get the data from the module he claimed he got it from, using the software he claimed he used. In fact, he didn't follow any procedures to formulate his crime scene reconstruction. And for all we know, the key cycle that he focused on may well have been his own triggered event. So moving on, we're going to listen to a little bit of Trooper Guarino's testimony because he talks about the EDR that we discussed in the last video.
So Burla is a specialized hardware and software used to download the infotainment and telematics modules in a vehicle.
Okay, so just to be clear, Burla has a completely different purpose to Bosch CDR Toolkit, where the Bosch Toolkit is focused more on control units and therefore has the ability to provide accurate telemetry of the physical world. It's what you would use in reconstruction of crash scenes via, for example, computer modelling, or to use the data to corroborate other evidence, such as that found in the more modern airbag module. Burla is way limited in reconstructing a crash or anything related to the physics of the vehicle. It's really just a corroboration tool of the CDR accident reconstruction tool. What I'm getting at is you can't replace one with the other because they've got two completely different functions.
Telematics module is basically like the SIM card for the car, and the infotainment system is your radio head unit that enables you to have Apple Play, CarPlay, or Android or Google Play for the vehicle.
And specifically on February 2nd, 2022, did you have occasion to remove that infotainment system from the vehicle pursuant to that search?
Yes, I did.
A whole year before Trooper Paul hooked up, or claims he hooked up, the Toyota Tech Stream. This will become relevant in a couple of minutes.
After we removed it from the vehicle, it was brought back to Norfolk DA's office.
Ruh-roh. Anytime these guys get their hands on evidence, stuff starts going missing. So let me guess, all of a sudden stuff is missing?
For a data extraction, or attempt to. So depending on the system, it's dismantled. They have this specialized hardware that actually goes on to the motherboards of these systems, and we're able to pull the data. Or the other option, if that's not viable, is to do a chip off where we have to basically destroy the motherboard and take the memory chips off the devices to try to get the data that way.
Listen, Linda, it's 2024, and you just said so yourself, it's got internet connectivity. And what comes with internet connectivity? Data storage by Lexus themselves. Why are you treating it like a Commodore 64?
At some point, were you able to download any information from that particular infotainment system from the defendant's vehicle?
And not from the infotainment system.
Oh, there it is. While it was in their custody, stuff went missing.
But Burla released a new item similar to a mechanic scan tool. It plugs into the OBD2 port, which is underneath the dash. So we're basically, if a mechanic went in there with a scan tool to tell you why you have a check engine light, this does something similar. So you plug it in, and then it pulls the car diagnostic data from that.
So essentially, he's connecting through the OBD2 port to the older EDR.
And as far as the data that you received from that, what, if anything, did you observe?
Again, I got a series of 14s was the numbers.
To be clear, what he should have got is a list of diagnostic troubleshooting codes, which under the OBD2 standards would consist of one letter and four numbers. The letter would generally represent one of four groups, would be B for body code, C for chassis code, P for powertrain code, or U for network code. That list of standard parameters that the codes would represent is called a PID. The PID list is actually widely available on the internet. Getting a list of 14s means that there's probably something going on with the fuel system, but I very much doubt that's what the codes were telling him. I think what the codes are saying is, somebody flipped the ones and zeros. This can easily be done by holding the motherboard and scuffing your feet on the carpet to create static electricity, but I can probably think of dozens of ways that you could wreck a motherboard and flip the ones and zeros.
It was no readable data. I reached out to Perla and asked them, I said, is there a reason why it pulled this data, but when I put it into the software, it's not telling me anything. It's not giving me any readable data. And they said they know it as diagnostic data, but they haven't got anything from Lexus to say these 14s, these codes mean this. Oh, they only know it as emissions.
Oh, should have used the Bosch tool.
It was placed back into our digital evidence lab.
Ruh-roh. More opportunities to wreck things.
And then we did eventually do a chip off to the device. It is a destructive process. As soon as we do it, we take those memory chips off. It's applying extreme amounts of heat to the motherboards to take the memory off. That'll heat it. You lose a lot of the soldering and capacitors, anything that's on that motherboard. So, like I said, once the memory chips are taken off, it's going to destroy the board.
Okay, let's dispel this myth once and for all. Back in the olden days, we're talking 80s and 90s here, everything was hell expensive. I mean, it's not much different today. New technology is usually more expensive. And so back then, replacing a chip yourself or having a tech replace it was actually the cheaper option to replacing the whole board. What you're watching while I'm talking is a chip-off process on an old Commodore 64. They were between the 1980 and 1985-ish models. Notably, the motherboard has holes all the way through it. These were handmade generally, and sometimes, like in the 90s, they moved to machine-made. And of course, some companies today still use these old machine-made motherboards, but mostly new tech is printed motherboards. This means instead of the chips having straight teeth or feet that go through the motherboard, they now mostly have bent feet, or in some cases no feet at all. We'll watch a chip-off process on a new motherboard in a moment, but the point being, today it is actually cheaper to replace the whole motherboard than to perform a chip-off process, and then replace the chip with a chip-on process. Now, when I say cheaper, it's just cheaper for the company who owns the board that you're getting the chip replaced by, for them to simply send you a new board. It's cheaper for them in labour costs and parts replacement, basically. But it's not unheard of. Many gamers might like to put their own chips on. They might buy a standard motherboard and decide they want a faster, insert ICU chip name here. It usually results in faster, bigger, better, because that's what gamers want. So let's watch a chip-off process on a newer motherboard.
I'm using a heat gun to apply heat around the chip on the legs. If you do not have a heat gun, you can use your soldering iron. After I've loosened the chip from the board, I will use my tweezers to lift the chip from the board. Then I will use my solder wick and iron to clean up the pads on the board. After I've removed all of the existing solder, I will use a Q-tip and some isopropyl alcohol to clean up the pads further.
At this point that the chip is off, this board is now unusable. And so in this sense, Guarino is right. Once the chip is off, the board is now destroyed. However, destroyed is a strong term. I would use unusable. and it can be made usable again, as we're about to see.
After I've cleaned the pads, I can get my replacement component aligned properly with my tweezers. There's a small dot on the chip. Be sure to line up that circle with the arrow on the board.
For those who are under the mistaken impression that these chips might forget what's stored on them when they're unplugged from power, let me assure you they are non-volatile chips, meaning whether they have power or not, they are not going to forget what's stored on them. This little dot here in the top right corner and the arrow are showing you which is the power pin. So as long as the chip is placed back on the board with pin 1 matching pin 1 on the board, then power will be restored and the chip will work again. The only volatile chips you might find on an infotainment system are probably going to be cache. Like, for example, if you press a button on the infotainment system, it will remember whilst ever there's power that you press that button. But when the power is turned off, the cache will be emptied out and it won't remember that you pressed that button. There's a multitude of cache examples I could give, but that's just one of them.
Next, I will use my tweezers to hold the chip in place and put some flux onto the legs of the component. Then I will add some solder to my iron and run the tip of my iron on the legs to solder it in place. After I have soldered one side of the chip in place, I will then rotate the board and solder each side of the chip to the board. On the last side I have created a solder bridge, which is not good. I will use my solder wick and iron to remove some of the solder I added. Then I will run my iron back over the legs with more solder and make sure there are no bridges between the legs.
So there you go. Chip on process complete and the board is now usable again. The application of heat didn't destroy anything, and there are mistakes you could make, like accidentally soldering two legs together. But if you know what you're doing and you check your work, you can pretty much add a chip back to a board again. And voila, it's not destroyed. So at best, I'm going to say Trooper Guarino was being disingenuous.
It was myself, AG Speak, and Maggie Gaffney.
And who is Miss Gaffney?
She was a defenses expert. She's the one who actually did the chip off, applying the heat and taking the chips off in our presence.
Unfortunately, the data was already destroyed by the time Maggie got in there to do the chip off process. But I did just want to emphasize the defense was present and did the chip off process. So I'm going to assume that it was done properly.
As I was told by AG, there was no data that was recovered off the infotainment system or the telematics module from the chip off.
So the infotainment system fried, the EDR fried, presumably the airbag system not fried because that's where Trooper Paul says he pulled the data from. So what does it mean when all of the systems on board the Lexus all fail at once? Because presumably, even though the airbag system did record some data, it was still missing some of that data, for example the timestamp. Should Lexus be recalling this model because everything failed all at once without even an actual crash happening? This is mind-boggling. They're essentially saying that the vehicle itself malfunctioned. There's actually federal laws that govern vehicle manufacturers' ECU units. This is part of the EDR unit, or as Guarino referred to it, the telemetric system on the OBD2 port. The federal government gave all manufacturers a specific time frame in which they had to upgrade all of their ECUs on all of their models to bring their entire range into line with the standards of safety. And by standards I mean like worldwide. We've all got safety standards for our vehicles and they all pretty much come from the same sources. The ECU unit standard was that it should control the safety features of each model, especially in the case of a potential accident. The federal government refers to this group of chips as ESC units. So essentially, I punched all this information into an AI and asked it to have a discussion about the potential legal issues being presented by the Commonwealth in court that all of the systems on the Lexus failed that fateful night. Before we get into it though, I would just point out that it is not the defence claiming that all of the componentry failed. It's the prosecution who's claiming that. And while they're alluding to it must be the driver's fault that all the electronics failed, what they're actually doing is implicating Lexus.
Hey everyone, welcome back. You know, every time I think about how much tech is crammed into our cars these days, kind of blows my mind.
It's like we're driving around in spaceships, but we just take it for granted, you know?
Exactly, and that's what we're diving into today. It's a topic that's, well, let's be honest, kind of unnerving.
Yeah, when tech goes wrong.
Precisely. And we're talking Electronic Stability Control Systems, ESC. You know, that thing that's supposed to keep your car from spinning out of control.
Yeah, like that patch of ice you don't see until it's too late.
Exactly. Except we've got info on a case where this system, well, it might have failed. And to make matters worse, no data was recorded to tell us why. So we're diving deep into the legal quagmire of what happens when your car's supposed safety net doesn't work the way it's designed to. And trust me, this one gets complicated. Ever slam on your brakes, and feel your car almost swerve out of control? It's scary.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
That's when Electronic Stability Control, ESC, swoops in.
Yeah.
Like a guardian angel of grip. You've probably experienced it, honestly, without even realizing. It's just, boom, disaster averted.
It's happening all the time, behind the scenes.
Exactly. So first things first, for anyone who's more familiar with, say, turning on the radio than the actual mechanics of their car, definitely not me, break down what ESC actually does.
Sure. So ESC is like having an invisible co-pilot who's really good at physics. It's constantly monitoring your car's stability, and when it senses a skid or a loss of control, like you hit a patch of ice, bam, it kicks in.
So what's actually happening? Is it slamming on the brakes?
It's way more sophisticated than that. It can apply brakes to individual wheels, kind of like targeting the problem area, and it can even reduce engine power to help you regain control.
So it's giving your car lightning-fast reflexes to counteract the skid.
Exactly. It's designed to prevent those oh no moments from becoming full-blown accidents.
But that's what's so troubling about this case we've got. The ESC might have failed, and we have no clue why, no data. And to make matters worse, it involved a pedestrian fatality.
Which brings us to the legal minefield. When a system like this fails, and there's no record of why, proving liability becomes a nightmare.
Okay, let's get into that. We've got a potential ESC failure, no data, and a tragic loss of life. What are the legal ramifications here?
Well, here's the thing. The law says manufacturers have to install these systems, right? And there are regulations about how they should work.
Right, so it's not like we're talking about some optional add-on here. This is standard safety equipment.
Exactly. But proving the system caused the accident, that's the crux of the legal battle.
So it's not enough to just say, hey, the ESC messed up, game over.
Not at all.
And if that wasn't enough, there's this whole thing with the police investigation, maybe botching some critical data.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's getting into...
Juicy stuff. So what kind of, pressure does that put on these manufacturers? Are they sweating bullets over this stuff?
Oh, absolutely. These regulations, that's the backbone of car safety, you know? They basically draw a line in the sand. This is what's reasonably safe by law. And for the companies making these vehicles, a huge deal. If they cut corners, ignore those rules, and then a defect causes an accident.
Ooh, it's bad.
Legal nightmare. We're talking lawsuits. Like the massive kind. Millions of dollars.
Right.
Plus their reputation's shot.
Yeah. It's like the stakes are even higher because this tech is literally there to prevent people from getting hurt,
Right.
Which brings us back to our case. So we've got this possibility, and this is where it gets really complicated, that the ESC did malfunction. And it wasn't just regular wear and tear. It was like a factory mistake. On top of that, we have this whole thing with the potentially messed up data. It's like, how do you even...
It really throws a wrench in things because this is where that whole chain of evidence thing is so important legally,
Yeah.
To use evidence in court, it's got to have this clear, unbroken path, right? From the source, in this case, the car's computer, all the way to the courtroom, any little slip up, like the police messing with that data, and boom, that whole chain is questionable. The defense could be like, nope, that data's messed up, can't trust it, shouldn't be allowed in court. That just really weakens the prosecution's case.
So we could be talking about a situation where even if the car was faulty because of this, like, procedural issue, it's almost impossible to prove.
It's a real possibility, yeah.
Yeah.
Really highlights the importance of proper procedure.
What options would the prosecution even have at that point? Is there anything they can do?
Well, they'd have to get creative. Eyewitness testimony, if there was any, right? Accident reconstruction, those experts are amazing.
Oh, right.
Maybe even looking into the car company itself, see if there have been similar complaints about their ESC.
Almost like a pattern of, hey, this keeps happening.
Exactly, trying to build that bigger picture.
But, on the flip side, the car company's lawyers, they're not just going to sit there, right?
Oh, no, they'll be ready.
What kind of arguments might we see from their side, given this whole messed up data situation?
Oh, their whole game plan is going to be reasonable doubt. Like, hey, we don't know for sure what caused the accident because the data is unreliable. It becomes this battle of the experts, each side interpreting the evidence their own way.
This case really shows how tech and the law and even just human error, they're all tangled up, It makes you think, like, as cars rely more and more on these systems, these cases are going to get even wilder, right?
Absolutely. This is just the beginning. I mean, we're already seeing self-driving stuff being tested on the roads, right?
Right.
The question of who's liable gets way more complex.
There's a whole other level of what does the law even say about this?
Exactly. A lot of uncharted territory.
It's fascinating, but also kind of makes your head spin a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.